Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today, we'll be unveiling a study, the state of open source in the Global South, as well as discussing the result of that study with our panelists. And before we start this panel, we have also a presentation that is done by Tabang Mashologo. And before we start all of this, maybe a short intro of the story behind this study that we've done in the Eclipse Foundation. So the original idea behind this study was actually a question, which is who is going to be the next generation of developers? And from this came several other questions. Where are they from? What is their relationship to open source? And what challenges do they face with open source when developing open source project and software and components? And in order to address this question, we looked at the numbers available on GitHub. And quickly, the first thing that came out was that already by 2028, the top 5 of countries contributing to open source on GitHub will be from the Global South. If you see this slide on the right, by 2028, the top 5 is made of India, the US, Brazil, China, and Indonesia. 4 of them, as I said before, coming from the Global South. So then the question was answering all the further questions that we had, right? If they're from the Global South, do they have specific challenges that maybe we're not addressing or we haven't addressed of the last 15, 20 years? What form of contribution do they have? Is there something unique? Is there something peculiar that was not addressed before? Is there specific needs? And what is the state of open source in the end in the Global South? So we conducted that study with various of our colleagues, but also a lot of different partners. And I'm lucky today to have with you Tabang Mashologu, who is the Vice President for Community and Outreach at the Eclipse Foundation, who will be telling you more about the study and sort of a summary of the findings that we have in this study that is available online. So Tabang, I will give you the floor for 10 minutes, and then Tabang will join us for the panel as well. Thank you very much.
Well, we're really thrilled to share the findings of this survey. As Enzo mentioned, this is the culmination of a lot of work by many stakeholders. And the study convincingly demonstrates that open source plays a crucial role in driving innovation, economic growth, and societal development across the countries that represent the global majority. So that's a term that really came to the fore in doing our research, that these are the countries that, as Enzo mentioned, are not only driving growth in terms of the developer ecosystem internationally, but also with demographic shifts, they represent where the majority of the world's population is. So very important countries and regions. We conducted the research over April and May of this year with the help of ClearPath Strategies, a global research and consulting firm, to develop and field the research. We also partnered with major community organizations like Open Source Community Africa and FOSS-Asia to promote the survey and ensure that it reached the right audience. The survey was available in English and Spanish and Portuguese to accommodate the various and diverse linguistic backgrounds of the respondents. That said, the survey includes over 400 respondents from 17 countries. Next slide, please. Including coverage from Argentina, Brazil, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, Malawi, the Philippines, and Vietnam. With that said, this is the largest in-depth survey of open source developers in the Global South ever, and we're really proud to have been part of that. What did we learn? So first and foremost, it turns out that developers in the Global South playing a really influential and growing role in the open source ecosystem. 3 things stood out to us in terms of the positive impact and potential of these developers. First of all, given that 77% of the respondents use open source, they are really positioned very prominently in the global ecosystem as folks who can contribute beyond just the usage. And the fact that 28% are maintainers and a quarter of them are creating new projects means that they're increasingly driving the agenda for these technologies. Now, I think by now everyone in the tech industry accepts that diversity is a good thing. What these by what these diversity sorry what these developers rather are bringing is fresh perspectives, new approaches, and contributions based on their local and regional experience that open source communities globally can leverage and benefit from. They're actively leveraging open source to advance their career growth, and what we've seen in the rest of the world is also relevant here, that they're learning new skills, they're advancing their careers, and solving profound technological problems and addressing needs leveraging open source. Now, in terms of security and career growth and documentation, we're seeing that there are some key factors that enable the increased use of open source, adoption of open source technologies in the global south. And the critical elements there are involving, empowering, and protecting these developers. And these developers told us exactly what they need in order to improve their experience. And fundamentally, it's about providing support, such as implementing security best practices, so that developers and their organizations and various stakeholders have the trust in the safety and robustness of these technology solutions. It also involves providing opportunities for career growth, delivering good documentation, and utilizing OSI approved licenses. Next slide, please. Now, it's about way more than the code is something that came to the fore in conducting this research. What we learned is that open source software developers are using their involvement in these communities to drive positive change well beyond the code base. We learned that they deeply believe in the socioeconomic impact of open source, and they told us about top three positive impacts to society from their involvement and participation in these communities. Number one, increased entrepreneurship and innovation. And secondly, the development of a stronger workforce of software developers. And third, improved educational opportunities. So we're really seeing the impact of open source go far beyond the bounds of the repositories and the software that's being developed. Beyond that, we're also learning, or we learned rather, that 59%, so a majority of respondents, believe that open source will significantly influence their country's economic growth. Upon digging further, we identified three ways, or a few ways rather, in which that's going to happen. Skills development and training to bridge that digital divide between the global north and south. And this is where there's a real opportunity to unlock the often underused potential of significant portions of these economies by enabling the equitable participation, particularly among youth and women in these countries. In addition, we learned that open source enables, much like it does in the rest of the world, startups and new businesses to leverage affordable and scalable technology. And we're seeing that developers in the global south have a significant impact across a variety of industries, including IT, financial services, telecom, and healthcare. And developers in the south are leveraging these technologies to drive innovation, improve services, and enhance operational efficiency. Next slide, please. Now, fundamentally, open source is crucial to innovation. So this is not a new story. It's encouraging to see it played out in a similar way in the global south countries that we surveyed. Nearly 2/3 of developers believe open source is critical for driving innovation in their countries. And they noted that open source makes technology more accessible to a wider population and contributes to overall improvements in software development practices. Finally, in terms of key findings, we heard from the policymakers we spoke to that they are aware of the United Nations involvement in digital public goods, so DPGs, which you'll hear more about over the course of the conversation today. And they see the United Nations as a robust facilitator for collaboration and promoting those open source projects that fit the DPG definition. fundamentally, there's a growing recognition that there is this intersection between open source, international development, and public policy initiatives. And we heard that collaboration between government, private sector, civil society, and international partners is essential to delivering and achieving the sustainable development goals that create a more equitable world for us all. So with that in mind, where do we go from here? So next slide, please. In terms of the outlook, uh, I'm happy to say that it's a positive outlook, and that was really a happy discovery in terms of the research that we conducted. Fundamentally, these findings highlight the incredible potential for the global open source community to grow in new and unexpected ways by tapping into the potential of the global south. So really it reorients the narrative that historically has held sway, which is the idea that the global north can help and advance the global south. It's more, how is the global south and developers in these communities, how can they contribute to helping the rest of the world, specifically given the fact that they are really uniquely positioned to contribute to the sustainability of open source by distributing the load and diversifying the contributor base and bringing their fresh perspectives to projects. So how can the different stakeholders, developers, policymakers, and business leaders in these regions help support and accelerate the impact of developers in the global south? In a few important ways. So first of all, developers can actively engage with the open source community globally to build their skills and network, and they can leverage opportunities for collaboration and learning to drive their personal career growth and more holistically and broadly advance innovation in their countries and regions. Secondly, policymakers can support open source by providing infrastructure and resources, and by collaborating with community groups and open source foundations like the Eclipse Foundation to promote sustainable development goals and innovation in their region. As we were talking about earlier, it really does take, pardon the mention, but it does take a village, in this sense, a global ecosystem of actors to drive this type of outcome. To that end, business leaders can contribute by offering grants, sponsorships, and funding for open source projects. We've seen this take shape. We need to see more in the way of organizing local workshops and hackathons and meetups to foster this type of collaboration. So take it from the virtual to the physical world, if you will. And maybe to appeal to the self-interest of these organizations, open source is a great way to identify potential employees based on their contributions to the open source projects that you care about as an organization and as a company. So with that in mind, I think we all have a role to play here. I just want to underline, before I cede the floor here, to the fact that this research affirms what many of us certainly believe, somebody like myself coming from the global south, that there's huge potential and there's a huge role that can be played by developers in these regions. So with that, I'll hand back to Enzo.
Thank you very much, Tabang. Can you all hear me? I think you can. So now, with these findings, and even me, I know the study, and I've discussed the result with Tabang many times. Every time I hear them, I have new ideas and new questions, and things that you should always discuss moving forward. So I'm really happy that we have a panel today to discuss these findings as well, and exchange ideas, exchange opinions as well. So today, unfortunately, Azhar couldn't join us, as far as I know. But we still have Otavio Santana, who is a Jakarta EE commuter and Java champion. And he will tell us what he believes the findings mean, and what it means as well for him as working on all these different projects. We also have Ruth Ikegah, who is a program manager in Open Source Community Africa, who was a partner for this research, as Tabang mentioned. And then we have Leah Gimpel, who is the director for AI and country engagement as the Digital Public Good Alliance, will also share with us her vision and the work that DPGA is doing on this. And together with us, as I said, we have Tabong Mashologu, who is VP for Community and Outreach at the Eclipse Foundation, and all of us will try to discuss these findings. So now, I think since we've all heard about this findings and the summary of these findings, I think I'll go for a question about the finding themselves. So I'll start, say, with you, Leah, that I see on the screen. Um, what is the finding from the survey that you think is the most relevant to your open source journey, in a sense, that your work that you do in the Digital Public Good Alliance? What is, one or two that you thought directly, oh, this actually is very relevant to the work that I do?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And first of all, compliments also to the Eclipse Foundation for doing this kind of research, because I think so you fill a really critical data gap here. So I've been talking a lot about open source with developers in the Global South about the ecosystem, but to actually have numbers is really helpful to support to support people on the ground. I think what is really interesting for us as a Digital Public Goods Alliance is this finding that the open source ecosystem majority per country influences what is actually needed in terms of specific support to grow the local ecosystem. And the insight that, of course, the more mature an ecosystem is, the more social and economic impact you can derive from it. And that's exactly what we try to do at the Digital Public Goods Alliance. We try to enhance the knowledge about digital public goods, which is basically open source software, open data, open AI models, and open content collections, which are relevant for the sustainable development goals and do no harm by design. And we have a great interest in supporting local ecosystems in both developing, but also using these kind of products to positively impact their trajectory, right? So to help attain the sustainable development goals if you want. And just this recognition that there are communities in different stages of development and that they all need different things, I think is super important. For us who are organizing specific support, who are working with a lot of UN organizations, who are implementing projects on the ground, because of course there's no one size fits all here. And I think that's a recognition that, can help shape our work and the programs that others are implementing in collaboration with organizations such as ours.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah. Otavio, I think we have you now. So I ask you the same question. When you hear the findings, and maybe you've read the report in its entirety, but the summary of the findings from Tabong as well, what is the finding, the number, the element that you think is the most relevant to sort of your open source experience or open source journey? What was the thing that you were suddenly, this actually, it's interesting. I could use that, or it reflects well my experience.
It reflects well my experience, especially because when you talk about open source, especially in the South, it's not only around soft engineering, soft in philosophy, it's also about social impact. And I can include myself in this change. So basically, open source changed my whole life and give me education, give me what I do, put food on my table. It's impressive that looking to the South, I'm not an exception. So I'm kind of the same trends in the South.
So what would you say, a follow-up question to this, what if you had to describe the impact that open source had in your local community, how would you describe it? So you shared with us your personal experience,
Oh,
but
yes, please.
what
When you talk about open source and impact, think more about education. So, especially in the South, our first language is not English. We don't have opportunity to practice English as well. When you talk about open source, is opportunity to speak English, to have opportunity to work to IT. That's still one of the highest incoming, at least in South America. I believe in the whole country, whole globe, but for sure, Latin America. We also have opportunity to have training, have in touch with people around the globe, increase the networking. So basically, when talk about open source and impact is education, networking, and learn different language, mainly English.
Okay, I see. It's very interesting to have your opinion on this because what I'm guessing is that you were not surprised by none of the numbers, the very first numbers that we pulled from GitHub originally. Those numbers, they were just, and even the summary of the findings to you, it just exemplified your experience of open source in your local community. It's interesting because when you discuss with leaders in companies or in government, it might not be the feeling that they have.
Yes,
Um,
yes. I mean, if you check, for example, the Latin America communities, those are usually around universities, society educations, where help people, especially poor people, to get your first job using technology, to help people to be able to learn a new language like English, to increase the opportunities and increase the salary. So for me, it was more like, okay, it does make sense because it was my reality, and I haven't seen that for a long time, especially in South America.
okay, thanks a lot, Otavio. Um, Ruth, I know you've had technical issues before, but I'd like to have your feeling on this. I'd ask you the same question in terms of describing the local impact of open source in your community, but I'm also curious if you have specific projects that you think have made an impact in your region or not, or maybe it's just generally open source. So if you're with us and you're done with the technical issues, I'd love to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I can communicate.
Okay, I didn't hear you very well. Um, so I suspect that you still have the same technical issues. Um, so we'd go to a following question. Um, Now the opposite. I, you know, uh, Leah, before I ask you what were the findings that were the most relevant, and so you shared with us the one that were relevant, the things that you work on and that are aligned with the work that you do. But what are the findings that actually surprised you? Is there any something that you're like, oh, I didn't expect this to be there?
Yeah, I would love to answer this question, but I also see my colleague Gulaji here already on the panel, and maybe he can also talk a little bit about his experience of the local impact of open source in his community because he's based in Nigeria, and as far as I know, he and Ruth also know each other and did some work together. So maybe he can just quickly take this question before I elaborate on what surprised me.
That is even better. Even when we have
Thanks.
technical issues, we have a solution. Balaji, I think you're with us already, and I can see you, and I think everyone can see you. So I'd ask the same question that I asked Ruth before. Could you describe the impact that open source had, the local impact that open source had in your community, but also if you think of any open source project that has made an impact in your region?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Enzo. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
All right, cool. Nice to meet you all. As Leah mentioned, and I'm not sure if I had Ruth talk earlier, but in this side of the region, we've basically had people, we always say these things and say that communities are built on shared struggles, and there are quite a number of shared struggles across the global south. And most of these struggles are best understood by the people. And at times when we come together and try to have like summits and try to talk about these things, and then we try to say people should try to align with the government as much as possible, because as much as we're trying to do stuff and we're also trying to improve the country and trying to improve different lives, it needs to be aligned with like the government needs and ensuring that policies aligns and how these things could work together. And over time, we've had people actually build stuff that solves social problems, and that's one thing we've been doing for the past years in this side of the world, and then figuring out what those problems are and then seeing how we can solve them. And that's one power of open source over time, because it's like multiple people, different backgrounds, different technical strengths. And I've worked with people across different like cities where we've not met each other before, and that's the whole power of collaboration. And we come together. This is the goal. This is what we're trying to solve, and then we've tried to solve that over the time in the past years. And for example, you see. There's this project, I think I saw this recently, like a project that's solving like land degradation challenges in some certain cities, and like had these things aligned with different SDGs and a bunch of that. And that has happened over time in the past years. And generally, we've just seen open source being able to bring people together, first to really understand the problem, and then to work together to solve that problem. It's not something that has ever existed before. I usually make this joke when I talk with people and say, before you had like, version control and the ability to collaborate, you probably imagine a world where I could have like a file in my hard drive, and then when I make my changes, I transport that hard drive to you somewhere else, and then we have to keep doing that back and forth. But we now have that ability to be able to collaborate in each of our houses based on whatever limitations we have. We still can have our voices heard and have our skills being represented, and that's the power of like computing, being able to like creatively solve problems the same way other people in other fields have been solving the same problems. So I think yeah, that's it's been really interesting, and I'm really excited about the research personally. And I think Leah has shed some light on how that aligns with also our goal at the Digital Public Goods Alliance in terms of finding the use, the discovery, and investment in digital public goods specifically. And we're also keen in the African region and specifically also in the global south. And yeah.
So I'm feeling, Bruce, I'll go back to you because I think you solve all the technical issues, and thank you very much for doing this and being resilient on this. So if I translate what Bolaji just said, and Bolaji, tell me if I'm wrong, it feels like it's the ability of open source to pulling people with the similar challenges at the technical level, also at the social level, because you bring people together that normally wouldn't be working together. That's where open source is doing it's a big impact. I feel like that's how I would summarize or translate. Is it also the impact that you see, or do you have another impact that you have identified at a local level for open source?
Okay, is my audio coming good?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
perfect now.
great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're experiencing a real life challenge here when as we talk about like these issues. So yes, I think the perspective I want to bring in is as regards the demographic of people, from specifically Africa that, participate in open source software. And even for me as a personal journey, I started open source really early on, just after graduating school, right? And you see like a lot of the people that participate in open source or contribute to of even technology in general. It's mostly young people, and even in open source community Africa, we're all the volunteer culture, the way people come together to you know enhance their careers through open source is something that is really, I see a lot from this part of the world, that people. And when I got into open source, I think the first project I contributed to was Genome. And the the first meeting I joined was people that had more experience, more technical experience, and also like more gap in terms of like age. So like when you look at this part, you see that there are a lot of people that are young contributing to open source, and I think I saw a lot of that represented in the research as well. So I think that's one of the impacts that's had, that young people can come together and like we're growing like a new generation of developers, right? So yes, that's one perspective I see.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's not the first time that I hear you talk about the youth and the opportunity related to open source and youth at the same time. So I was trying to open the floor before to a different question, sort of the opposite question. And I also want to bring Tabang on this after reacting to what surprised you in the research. Is there a finding that you didn't expect in the study? Something that in the summary that Tabang just did, or when you were reading the report that you didn't expect? So I'd start with you, Leah, and then we do a quick round tour the tab.
Yeah, what I found fascinating is that the majority of developers that you surveyed, that they are aware of economic impact opportunities that open source brings to their countries. So that was really surprising because, of course, people realize that they can benefit on a personal level from skills development, from language learning, as we just heard from Otavio, but they have this broader picture in mind. I think that's really great actually because we can work with this. If we want to build open source ecosystems that have a substantial impact on economic and social development, then this is actually the right mindset that we need from developers.
Yeah, I agree. It's also something that very much surprised me. It's funny you brought it up. Otavio, is that something similar for you, or did you have a different thing that surprised you? It feels you already know about the social impact because you mentioned it before at the personal
Yeah,
level as
yeah.
well.
That was my feeling for us, especially because uh, my first contact with open source was like 50 years ago. So we didn't have the same connection that we do have today. We don't have the same knowledge that we do have today. And I remember the first system operation I received on my email address that was Ubuntu because if you remember that time, to do soft development was super expensive because the IDE we need to pay for use it was not that for free, right? So Eclipse Foundation with the IDE came easier for us to have access to read and learn. Java, we could use it if without paying for it. If you remember 50 years ago, for example, to have a Mac today is expensive, but 50 years ago is way more expensive to have it. And plus some taxes for importation. Brazil does not have a factory of Apple, for example. Um, the same for Microsoft. Microsoft. So I mean, if without open source, I won't be here to talk with you guys. I will follow the trends of the Brazilian probably. I will working as blue label person to try to survive every single day. I want able to speak English. I want able to go to college, to finish college, and things like that. Because Brazil does provide some public uh, university. However, it has like the schedule for the morning, evening, night. Only people who cannot work can do to public education, especially university in Brazil. And that was not my case. I need to have money to have food on my table, right? So the open source make me possible to have my dream to become a software engineer, to do have the graduation, things like that.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Otavio. I can only underline how important it is to hear this sort of testimony and testimonials. And I'm concluding from your statement is that for someone on which open source had such an impact, it feels like the findings were not surprising, which is something we went through before. Ruth, do you have
Yes.
a similar experience? Do you have what is there? Not talking about experience, but more coming back to the question, which is nothing surprised you in the study. It's like it was translating something you were already living and that you already seeing, or is there a finding in the study that surprised you?
I think I'll go with what Leah said. Like, you know, here, like with what Open Source Community Africa has been doing in the past years is, advocating for open source in Africa, create events through events, mostly like with events and local community chapters. You know, it's people are still we're still like learning, and people are using open source, yes, and mostly using it as a way to grow their careers, which is something that was highlighted in the research, right? A good percentage of people believe in it as a career builder, a career stepstone. But understanding like how does it impact the real world, or like connection with like digital public goods, like that economic importance, a lot of people are still trying to understand. And most of the time in events, when we organize events, a lot of our advocacy is geared towards like helping people understand. Even when we invite people from like different regions to come to talk about open source, it's like advocacy. So I think it was interesting to see that, and then it wasn't just Africa that was covered in that research. So like the global south, like other regions. So I think that bit, that economic importance bit, was also like surprising to me. And just seeing how far other government interest in open source. So I think that was also another part, because like here, while I think there have been some efforts with our government, for like it's still something that they need to improve on, like that, like I think with like the communities doing the work. I think it was also interesting to see how other regions are engaging with their governments, and their governments are participating in open source and seeing the benefit of it.
I see. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Um, Balaji, in one sentence, I want to bring you back on this. In one sentence, because I'm also mindful of time, and I want to hear what if Tabang is surprised on what everyone else has been surprised on or not. In one sentence, is there something that surprised you, or not at all, or what surprised you if you have been surprised?
Yeah, I think nothing in particular surprised me other than what others have said. I think the research clearly captures what is happening in the global south. And I think that's pretty much it. I would stop here since you said one sentence so I don't go on talking, because I do have a lot to say. So
All right. Then I will go back to you right after then. Tabang, I want to hear your feeling on this. So I know when you worked on this that we discovered things together as well, and you discovered things with this study, things that you already know, things that were proven right, that feelings that you had originally. Are you surprised by what people are surprised about or not surprised about, actually, in the case of Otavio, for instance?
No. And maybe just to respond positively, I saw a lot of affirmation and validation, let's say, of what we know to be the case anecdotally through our own stories, my own stories, knowing folks like Ruth and Bolaji and many other such people. So I think the reality is, maybe as Leah said, the data that we were able to gather here in doing this research, which was a tremendous investment of time and let's be honest, scarce resources for us all, we really now have a data set that we can reference and use as a basis for more discussion, advocacy, more work that will help support, acknowledge, resource, celebrate the contributions of developers in the global majority. And I really want to underline that. That's a term that was new to me as we embarked on this research. We were saying, okay, global south. I got an education myself because Otavio, you're referring to things many years ago. Similarly, I was using terms that were outdated in terms of the developing world. Well, this is the global majority. This is where the majority of the world's population is. And what we're seeing is that, as validated by this research, is that they are creative, they're having an impact, they've got tremendous potential, and I think there's a foundation and an opportunity for them to do more. One specific plug I'll make is that, and to be perfectly honest, I was delighted by this. My personal hero, one of them is my mother. So to see in our research that we had a representation, if we look back at the numbers, of 35% of the respondents to this survey identified as female. So women represented 35% of the respondents in this survey. As we were doing our literature review of other such surveys, we find that in the industry as a whole, the software industry as a whole, it's maybe 10% to 25%. If you look at, I think GitHub Octoverse most recently had 23 to 25% of their respondents were female. So I'll say that again more simply. 35% of the respondents to this survey, 35%, if we extrapolate, of the developers in the Global South are women. For me, that is a very powerful statement, because we talk about open source driving socioeconomic impact and change, and helping to address the sustainable development goals, one of which is gender equality, right? Addressing gender inequality. So to see that reflected, I think open source, it's not the solution to all problems, but it's definitely an enabler and a catalyst for some of the things that I think will make this a better world for all of us.
I've seen many of you nodding when Tabang was explaining this. If you want to react to this specific part, feel free to take the floor. Otherwise, I'd go to another part of the panel, as I don't see anyone coming to the floor. So we discussed many of the findings already. And now I think it's time to go for the 15 minutes that we have left on more on the challenges side. Less about the study, more about the reality of open source in the Global South, which is something that the report touched upon, right? Open source matters. Open source has positive impact. Open source also has challenges, and we should be able to attack them and tackle them. So I'd ask the question to you, Otavio, again. What do you think are the challenges that you faced in promoting open source participation and adoption in your region? Whether it is, you mentioned education, so that could be for education, but also industrial implementation of open source, using open source components, etc. What are the challenges that you faced when promoting this in your community and in Brazil?
Oh, yes. Right now, the challenge that we face right now is the speed of knowledge. So we have a huge amount of technologies, articles, and material come out, and it's become a huge challenge to translate to Portuguese the same pace that we do have new technologies and methodologies. If you compare like 15 years ago, we do have some materials in Portuguese and in English in almost the same time. Right now, even only in English, the material become deprecated super fast. And to people who do not speak English, right now it's become even more harder to stay same pace to a professional who does not speak. So in general, my huge challenge is to help people who do not speak English right now.
Thank you very much. It's really something that I didn't think of before. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Bruce, same question to you. What are the challenges that you see when promoting open source? Because that's what Open Source Community Africa does a lot.
Yeah. So I think I'll bucket them into 3 or 4 different things. So I talked about earlier the demography of people, right? And when you're dealing with young people, and even most of our contributors are between like getting into tech, already in tech, we have a lot of people in the community. You have a very large size of people that are interested in participating. And then also you think of when you're trying to introduce technology, or trying to introduce concepts, you see that people are at different levels in their career. So that poses a challenge when people are trying to understand how do I contribute to a large code base? How do I understand the technical aspects of this software that I'm trying to contribute to? And in general, we've seen how a lot of people are beginning to advocate for better documentation, better onboarding processes. But when you're seeing that people that are trying to get into this community or this project at sometimes maybe 1-3 years, 4 or 5 years experience in their journey, sometimes it's really hard. And then when you look at the size in terms of, there are a lot of people that are interested, and which is good, right? When you have a lot of people that are interested in getting into open source or contributing. But when it comes to sharing opportunities, that size becomes a problem, right? Because you have there are lesser resources. You're trying to share an opportunity, and then you get overwhelmed with size, right? So that's one of the second challenge I've seen. And then the one that is really very evident with infrastructural challenges, it's a long list, right? Down from internet, power, it's very frustrating when you're trying to give your free time. And also leads me to like the last thing, talking about the last thing. Volunteering is also hard. Putting people together to give their time, especially when you have these infrastructural challenges, is also something that is hard for us. Like bringing people together. After some time, they get jobs, jobs that pay them, and then they don't have that time anymore to invest in the community, right? So we see that happen a lot, where people are engaged at a particular period of time, but after some time, when they get full-time jobs, they don't come back to the community, and that's something that is valid for them, because time is important to them. And and sometimes these internships, like outreaching, go somehow code, they kind of help to get people opportunity and also get them some money while giving their time out. So but then you see that these opportunities also, there are lesser of them. So those different things in terms with demography, like trying to engage young people, also with the size, the infrastructural challenge. And we also have the language diversity as well. Like for example, in Open Source Community Africa, we have a lot of chapters. And for some chapters they are French speaking. There's also the language diversity. And in these different chapters, you see how the challenges play. So yeah, so those are different things that I have encountered, and we keep trying to see how we can overcome them. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Olaji, I'm curious of your opinion here, because I feel like one element that I'd like to come back to is the elements of volunteering and the time and the challenge that it creates. When you couple the fact that you're putting some of your free time on open source components together with other challenges that you could have at the local level that Ruth mentioned, power, internet connection. I wonder, because Ruth mentioned volunteering, I wonder if you have this opinion too of maybe lack of recognition, in a sense that, in many regions in the world, people contribute also because it matters for their company and the organization or the administration if they work in the public sector to contribute to an open source component or to contribute to an open source project. But it felt with the statement from Ruth that, if it's volunteering, maybe organizations don't recognize the value of contributing to open source component and open source software. Is that a feeling that you have as well? Is that something you share?
Yeah,
As a
definitely,
Chilean,
Enzo. Yeah, definitely, Enzo. And I think generally for things like this, I mean, a large part of technology we have today in the world is built on open source. And I mean, there are a lot of persons who are involved in that process that no one knows, right? Both in the private sector, and but also in the public sector, and also both in governments. And you have that across in multiple dynamics. And one thing you find, especially for example in the public sector with governments, is that there seems to be like, I don't know how to put it, but I think Ruth mentioned that a bit, where it's like no one wants to work together, and it's like a black box where maybe the governments are actually comfortable with having things the way it works in some part of the global south, and we're quite excited to see that that's changing in many part of the global south, where you have governments actually being involved in these processes. As Ruth mentioned earlier, the communities do this groundwork. They understand the problems. They actually figure out all the strategies. There's a limit to how much work they could do, in one sense, if like the policies are not aligned, or if the government are not willing to, for example, provide some kind of data. Like Leah mentioned earlier, this is why this research is very helpful, because now we have some data to use, at least in terms of advocacy for this part of for these conversations. But in terms of innovation and how we solve these problems in many parts of that, there's certain data that, for example, we just don't have if these people don't work with us in that sense, right? And we have that happen over and over where these people do the work and no one really, cares or even wants to give back in that sense. And as Ruth mentioned, it's people's time. It's like volunteering, and you have people actually wanting to solve this problem. And recognition cuts across many things. Honestly, I know sometimes we look at recognition on the side of financial support, which is good. And there's recognition also in terms of access. There's recognition in terms of connection and networks and infrastructure, as Ruth mentioned. And I was speaking with someone earlier, and then we talk about, for example, the infrastructure concerns in terms of, like, for example, training models or something. I remember I did my bachelor's dissertation, and to train very basic models, like even with like a highly fair like quad core Intel computers, you barely can spend like hours doing those stuff. And you have many people in this region who cannot innovate in that field merely because they do have the expertise, they do have the ideas and the insights, but they don't have so much of the hardware to, like, do most of this stuff. And like this is where support comes in terms of the different use cases and different dynamics of how these problems could be solved. So yes, I do agree, and we do need those recognition in terms, and this is why we're excited to do more of the Digital Public Goods Alliance in terms of actually finding these projects. We do have like a couple of digital public goods that are actually being built in the global south, even though you have that spread across, and then you have most of this project, and then we are trying to also find more of this project, and also to make people see them in a sense where also countries and governments can also adopt this project and also use them, giving recognition back to those who are building this product, which is very key for the global south. So yeah, do agree definitely.
Thank you for sharing this with us. Tabong, working together as the big challenge, it felt like it's we've had many discussions on the work that the foundation is doing. It felt like it's exactly organization come to us because they want to work together and they're not exactly sure how to make it happen. So what's when you hear that this is the biggest challenge, what's your feeling?
Yeah, I feel like challenge is another way of thinking about opportunity, to be perfectly honest, right? So our perspective and my perspective as somebody who's immersed in a community of communities at the Eclipse Foundation, uh, we are currently involved in many initiatives that span the globe and span a variety of diverse stakeholder groups, both in terms of individual developers, all the way down to individual developers and small uh, uh, project communities to some of the largest corporations in the world. And I think that leaves me hopeful, particularly in the context of the data and the conversation that we have today and the discussion that is ongoing, for us to connect with developers in these regions and organizations like Open Source Community Africa, FOSS Asia, our various collaborators throughout the world, to see if we can actually make a dent at some of these challenges, right? So we've heard about the infrastructure challenges; those are real. I think early on in conversations with our community experts, one thing that came across was that while those infrastructure challenges are real, the people that we are dealing with in terms of the developers in these regions are highly resilient, talented, and creative. And I think that's a powerful finding from here, is that now you have somebody sitting in Lagos, in Sao Paulo or Johannesburg, or in other countries and cities, who now have access to the same tools and technologies that a software developer sitting in Palo Alto, California has. So I think things have never been better. Now is the best time, as they say, but I think we all need to work together. And I know that in terms of both in terms of the mission statement and our concrete strategies that we are devising at the Eclipse Foundation, our goal is to work more effectively with the various stakeholder groups to actually try and advance some kind of agenda that that supports and really activates the potential of these developer communities. So a bit of a long answer there, but hopefully that addresses the question.
No, but it was a perfect answer in the sense that, you know, there are commuters, there are developers, you have companies, you have volunteers, you have government, and there is a role also for foundation in the whole supply chain, and at least that's the experience that we've had so far. And so, you know, having the understanding of the VP of Community of the Eclipse Foundation specifically on this and what role the foundation could take, because, you know, is there a foundation taking that role right now, or you know, that's also a conversation to have, and I think it was very interesting to hear you answering this. So I want to go to Leah right now, because Leah, you represent an organization together with Bolaji that, you know, it's not one region. It's the Digital Public Good Alliance. Is the say the whole planet, the globe, and say since we only have 5 minutes, end up with some hopeful messages, right? Where do you think the changes is going to come from? Where do you expect open source participation to change if we talk about the global south specifically? Because I know you have members from, you know, pretty much everywhere. I remember seeing members from literally every single region in your membership.
That's not such an easy question for probably 2 minutes, so that others can share their thoughts as well. Well, I think there's a lot of momentum around digital public goods and open source software. We can see this with the Global Digital Compact, where digital public goods are mentioned specifically with their definition, and that is a UN member country adopted document that actually provides a really good background, I think. We also see when it comes to open source AI, for instance, that the Digital Economy Working Group Ministerial Declaration of the G20 coming out of Brazil mentions open source technology specifically to support developing countries in attaining the SDGs and overcoming challenges. So I think there is this notion of that we need to invest more into these communities, also from a global level. On the same line, the African Union has their own African Global Compact, where DPGs are their own pillar and where they commit to building more open source platforms. And I think this is a great momentum. And what we need to do is to connect these different pieces, right? I mean, we have the open source community, we have these high-level political initiatives, we have organizations such as the Digital Public Goods Alliance, UNDP, the ITU, were doing their open source ecosystem enablement project, where they're supporting countries in building their OSPOs. And I think all of this needs to come together to help develop the open source communities according to their status where they're in, right? So to circle back to where we started with, different communities need different things in order to develop and to enhance their economic and social impact. And I think it's all of our task to find out what this exactly is and also to learn from each other. And I think that's the beauty of open source, right? That we are here to learn from each other, that we are here to build on each other's efforts and collectively enhance the well-being of people. Maybe that's a bit high level, but I think there are like really good pieces already in place and we need to connect the dots better.
That is an hopeful message, exactly what I was hoping for. Thank you very much. So I have this challenge of myself, which is finishing right on time. So what about this? Otavio, Ruth, and Bolaji in that order. Can you give me a 20-second answer to that question? I know it was a tough question. Leah said it before. So it's even tougher to respond in 20 seconds. What do you think will change? And where would you like to see the change? Otavio?
What I'd like to see the change is impact even more people around the globe and have a better distribution of opportunities for everybody.
More of the same and better distribution. Ruth?
I think for me, open source in every different sector and like that, enhancing that collaboration with the different communities, like Leah said, like foundations, government, I think there's been a lot of effort with that and doing social good as well. So, yeah.
Balaji?
Yeah, I think for me, we're quite similar to that. Basically, just recognition for the work that's being done and being able to actually help people see that work and use that work.
Okay. Thank you very much for being here with us. It is 4:30. Thank you for allowing me to overcome my challenge, finishing on time. And thank you very much for joining us and for all the viewers as well that were here with us today. So with this, I would conclude this panel and thank everyone again for joining us and for coming.